Well, good morning. When Pastor Jessica asked me to fill in today, I, of course, was excited and looking forward to it, but I realized my, I would say, preaching muscles were a little, not very warmed up and a little weak, and I've been nervous, excited, anxious. It's all new. So thank you for inviting me to come up and share this day with you, this opportunity to worship together. As I prepared, there were several things going on, and I was surprised. So in the UCC community, we get our roots here in Bloomington as a Baptist church. And years ago, there was on this Sunday in January, in the liturgical calendar, they called it Life Service Sunday. And wouldn't you know that in 1959, the president of the American Baptist Convention, Joan Thatcher, reached out to none other than Martin Luther King Jr. and asked him in July of 1959 to write down how he was called into ministry. And what MLK wrote ended up being published in the bulletin for the American Baptist Church in January of 1960. I did not know this, and as I was preparing for today's sermon, and in the scripture reading from John, and thinking about what's happening in the landscape of today, and that this weekend is the celebration of MLK, it was so exciting to see this, that not only this history, but the history of our church community as well, the Life Service Sunday. So aren't you curious what MLK wrote back to the American Baptist Church? This is what he wrote back to Joan Thatcher. Well, first, I have to add this. Thatcher wrote to him in the request on what called you into ministry. She noted, apparently, many people still feel that unless they see a burning bush or a blinding light on the road to Damascus, they haven't been called. And this is what MLK responded with. My call to ministry was neither dramatic nor spectacular. It came neither by some miraculous vision nor by some blinding light experience on the road of life. Moreover, it did not come as a sudden realization. Rather, it was a response to an inner urge that gradually came upon me. I came to see that God had placed a responsibility upon my shoulders, and the more I tried to escape it, the more frustrated I would become. It seems that we celebrate and reflect on the life of MLK, but we hear the same prayers, words, and famous speeches by MLK, and I had never read those words. So what I say to that is, God calls us into service, life's service. In this story in John, I envision when Mary, his mother, realizes that the wedding party had not planned for enough wine. And Mary turns to her son and says, Jesus, they have run out of wine. And I can really appreciate what Jesus says. He says, Mother, it's none of our business. What does this have to do with me? Now, I see here, I have my two children here, and I could hear my own son saying something like, Mom, mind your own business. don't be a Karen here. I sort of could hear him saying this. Why is this my problem? Why is this our problem? And what Mary does next is what I love. She turns to the servants and says, listen to what he says. It's such a drop the mic moment. Listen to what he says and do it, and leaves. And here is Jesus, like, okay, and looks around and thinks, he says, it is not my time. It's not time for me to be called to a life of service. And yet, Jesus responds. God is calling each of us to a life of service. And we might not be ready. We might not think it's time. We might be waiting until something in order to act. But God calls us to action now. Because God is calling us into service, just as Mary called Jesus into service. Our best flows now. Our best flows now. What I also appreciate about this John story of the wedding in Cana is when Jesus doesn't quite know how he's going to respond, he just does. And there are these big urns that are lining the wall. These urns are not urns of wine. They did not hold wine. As a matter of fact, they were used for the ceremonial washing. Can you imagine using your bathtub for where you're going to fill with water and then serve people wine? The life of service never looks like what we think it would look like. I was reflecting on this and I was thinking, what must it have been like looking around? What am I going to do? And Jesus calls and says, fill these big urns with water. And the servants filled them with water. And these urns, as I said, were not urns for holding food. They were urns for holding water in which to have ceremonial washing, to prepare for the wedding. And I did think, if I had known that, if I was at the wedding, I'm not so sure I'd be too excited about drinking that, whether it was water or whatever was in it. I'd be suspect. I'd be wondering, is that safe? Is that clean? But Jesus, he tells the servants to fill the urns with water. The servants do that, and the caterers at the wedding serve the water. And the water is no water any longer. The caterer goes to the bridegroom and says, "Why did you save the best for now?" This is the opposite of what normally happens. Typically, the best wine is served first, and then everyone gets a little tipsy, and then we serve the cheap wine later. But you did the opposite. Because God saves the best for right now. We may be sitting here thinking that maybe our best days were in the past. There's a lot going on right now in the world, and it's easy to look back and think it was better then than it is right now. Or perhaps the future is downright scary. It can feel really heavy and scary. And in this story, we are reminded that the best is now. And we are part of providing, making sure that that best, that liberation, that free-flowing love happens. Because it is each of us being called into service to let our best flow. And so what does that mean for us today? It means that our response is extravagant love. In a world where at every turn we are told we aren't enough. We are told, we hear how to not have a big picnic table of God's love or picnic blanket of God's love and welcome, and to pick and choose who should be invited to join us at the table. When we hear people call God's creation illegal, aliens, it is on us to respond with an extravagant love. When we hear a world speak of hate for our LGBTQ siblings, it is our call to respond with extravagant love. When the world says that anti-racism and issues and words like diversity, equity, and inclusion are bad words, are to be scared and fearful of, our response as a church is to respond with extravagant love. And when the world tells us we're too old, too unskilled, it's not time, it's too cold, it's too hot, there are so many excuses. It's too late. God reminds us in this story to respond with extravagant love and to trust that not only are we enough, but we are the best, because the best is now in what we have to offer, and trusting that in our service, in our act of service, it will fill the need. My friends, in this story, God reminds us that each of us are called into service. If we think about even MLK in 1959, way before, we know who he was and what he stood for. Even then, learning that there was no burning bush, there was no light on the road to Damascus, that he was called because it just made sense to him. He wanted a life to stand for social justice, to fight for the oppressed, to be a voice in the wilderness. And that is a lesson for us all. So this next week, and every day going forward, when we find ourselves saying, it's not time, I'll wait until, or life was better when, remember this wedding in Cana, when the best was served up in urns that were really an unlikely vessel to hold God's best. Where is God calling you? What life service is God calling for this church community? May we each act, just taking that one step forward and trusting that not only is it enough, but it will be the best.